Good afternoon and welcome to Jiggers' Place. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every other Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific time to talk about all those things except business and professions that I talk about on my shows the other days of the week. Great books, life, and cocktails, not necessarily in that order. So today I'm going to be talking about a book that my daughter, Madeline, asked me to read several months ago called Flowers for Algernon. It's a classic book from, I believe, the early 1960s. And she had heard about it and was fascinated by it. And so we bought a couple of copies and, wanting to be a good dad, I read it and I started reading it and I couldn't put it down. It's an absolutely wonderful book. And so in honor of Flowers for Algernon, where I think one of the central themes of the book is virtue. What is virtue? How do we attain a state of virtuousness? I looked around for a cocktail that had something to do with virtue and could not find one. And so I tried a little experiment. I went on ChatGPT and I asked it to create a cocktail with the theme of virtue, and it came up with something called the Virtue Cocktail. And I've never tried it, so this will be an experiment for us. But the cocktail is made with one of my favorite spirits, gin. This is the rack gin that I keep. It happens to be Tanqueray, and it's just a great all-around gin. And the gin symbolizes transparency and clarity. And then the next ingredients is fresh lemon juice, which, lemons have a certain sharpness to them. So there's a sharpness of judgment that is part of being virtuous. And then honey syrup, which, let's see, it's, okay, so this is what ChatGPT came up with, which I think is quite clever. A sweet yet natural element symbolizing truth and simplicity. Now, I wasn't familiar with what honey syrup was, and it turns out basically it's honey and very warm water mixed together. So it makes the honey more liquid, but very tasty. I will tell you, not a big honey fan, but really like the honey syrup. And then a dash of, I'm using Bitterman's Scarborough bitters, as in, Are You Going to Scarborough Fair, the famous song by Garfunkel. All of a sudden I can think Simon and Garfunkel. And it brings this sort of calm, peaceful vibe of the 60s, at least that part of the 60s. Of course, the 60s had its violent side as well. Just a dash of, like I say, Scarborough's bitters. It's a savory herbal tasting bitters. And then it all gets put into a cocktail shaker. I've already put the ice in the cocktail shaker so I can move this along a little bit more quickly. And so we're going to start out with 2 ounces of gin. That's 1. 2. I keep a pretty tight bar here, so not a lot of working space. Next is an ounce of fresh lemon juice. And then 3/4 of an ounce of the honey syrup. Let me make sure I find the right. Okay, and a dash of the Scarborough bitters. Oops. Okay, and as we've done on the other times, the idea is to really not just kill their ingredients, but mix them and dilute them a little bit so that the flavor of the different ingredients is opened up. You can see it's already starting to get nice and frosty. That's always a good sign. Let's take it for about another 10 seconds. Now, for those of you who are shoppers, you may recall a department store called Barney's. It closed a few years ago, but many years ago, got probably close to 35 years ago. One of my clients, as a holiday gift, gave me a gift from Barney's that I couldn't use, and so I went there to exchange it. And I got these lovely coupes. There are several. I have a dozen of them in 6 different shades. So we're gonna strain this into the coupe. There we go. And let's see if this is any good. Right? It's going to be a little bit like a gimlet, I suppose. Well, you know what? ChatGPT is a pretty good mixologist. So I'm going to move over now to the sofa, and I'll see you there in a moment. So here we are at our normal Thursday afternoon spot. This Virtue cocktail is quite refreshing. I think if I made it again, I'd use a little bit less lemon juice because the lemon is sort of overpowering everything else, but it's very nice. So, by the way, if you want to get the cocktail recipes in advance, all you have to do is sign up for my email list. Just go to my website, bemmel.com, scroll all the way down to the bottom, and you'll see a place where you just put in your email address and click, I think it's subscribe or whatever it says. I don't do heavy emails. I do one email about 2 hours before each of my broadcasts, just as a reminder for that a show is coming up, and maybe during the year a few others. But you're not going to get bombed with tons and tons of emails from me. That's just not what I do. So okay, so this is the book I've been talking about, Flowers for Algernon. It's written by Daniel Keyes. You can see more than 5 million copies sold right there. And let's see. Yeah, the book was originally written in 1959. Okay, so I was a little bit off on the publishing date. And then I guess it must have been the copyright for some reason was renewed in 1966. So the book is essentially about a young man named Charlie Gordon. And he is what was called at the time mentally slow. So he was functional in that he could work at a job and all those kind of things, but he didn't have a real strong intellectual capacity. In fact, he had reduced intellectual capacity.
And he's asked to be the subject of a scientific experiment where he's given a drug, basically, that will enhance his intelligence. Now, Algernon is a mouse, and you can see, this is Algernon, right? A white mouse, which was, sort of the common animal to use for science, or the sort of classic animal to use for scientific research. So Algernon was tested with the drug first, and became much more intelligent than the other mice. And so then the follow-on test is to try it on a human. And so Charlie Gordon is the one selected to do that. He agrees to the experiment. Now, there's kind of a hitch to the experiment, and that is the drug. The impact of the drug will not be permanent. Nonetheless, he's intrigued by the idea of being smart, because he knows he's not a particularly smart young man. And he sees smart people around him, who he really respects, and he thinks, I'd like to be like those people. So, in the course of the book, he goes through this arc of increasing intellectual intelligence, while at the same time experiencing the impact of that on his life more broadly. And there's an awakening that takes place in him as he starts to discover, or he starts to, in essence, remember things that have happened to him when he was younger, that either he had just sort of pushed into his subconscious, or he didn't really understand clearly what was happening at the time, that now that he's become intellectually aware, he's able to interpret in what we as the readers would probably consider to be in a more accurate way. So look, as I'm sure you can appreciate, historically, people who were mentally slow oftentimes were teased, were harassed, and the fact of the matter is, Charlie didn't realize that that's how he had been treated during his life, because he just didn't have the capacity to understand that. But as he gets more intellectually advanced, he comes to realize how these people who had said they were his friends had, in essence, mistreated him. And as well, one of the things he notices is that although one of the things we notice is, although he's becoming intellectually more intelligent, he's not really becoming more emotionally intelligent. So his emotional growth does not at all keep pace with his intellectual growth. He's very naive, especially for a young man his age. His interactions with women, for example, are difficult for him to understand, both emotionally and intellectually, because much of the understanding of interpersonal relationships is a combination of the two, right? So, if you think about the show, The Big Bang Theory, right? The sort of central character, Sheldon, right? He's clearly the smartest person in the group, or, well, the smartest person. Let me say, he's the most intellectually intelligent member of the group, if for another reason than he has an eidetic memory, and yet emotionally he's the most immature of the group, right? So the two do not go in concert at all. They're really two different parts of our growth as individuals. And so he, as the story progresses, Charlie really struggles with a lot of the um, things that happen in his life that have emotional dimensions that he is not mature enough to understand, to really to deal with. And that's part of that's one of the themes of the book. Another theme of the book is the way in which disabled people or people with disabilities are treated. So, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, Charlie at the beginning, while before he becomes more intellectually aware, he doesn't realize how his coworkers, for example, are the way they're treating him. They're not actually treating him like a peer friend. They treat him almost like a mascot, and in some cases even abuse him. And that was, again, not uncommon, a way for mentally ill people or mentally slow people to be treated at the time. If you've ever seen the play or the movie A Cuckoo's Nest, that's I think the play is earlier than Flowers for Algernon, but the movie is I think it came out again in not again. I think it came out in the 60s, if I remember correctly. Just as a side note, when I was in high school, we did that show, A Cuckoo's Nest. I played Dr. Scanlon. It was my big theater debut in high school. And part of the theme of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is the way in which mentally ill, disabled, mentally deficient people are treated. In One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, these are people who are institutionalized, and it gives an insight into this that at the time, I think a lot of people, they didn't know about it. So unless you happen to have someone in your family who was in a mental institution, you probably had no idea what the conditions were like. So again, the path that Charlie Gordon takes through the story shows us how he becomes aware of his mistreatment, and he becomes increasingly incensed about it. As he becomes, and justifiably so, by the way, as he becomes more aware of it. So another theme of the book is the ethics of science and experimentation. So the lead scientist considers himself a very, very ethical practitioner, and he gets what we might call informed consent on Charlie's part to do this. And yet at the same time, there seems to be somewhat of a lack of appreciation for what this whole for how this whole experiment is impacting Charlie, not as the subject of an experiment, but as a human being. And if you know anything about the requirements for using human subjects in research today, they're very much more stringent than they were in the 1950s and 60s. There are boards that have to vet projects, all kinds of things that go on to screen what researchers and scientists are planning to do. Of course, none of this, or virtually none of it, existed back in the 1950s. And my feeling is that there's a certain almost coldness to the way the lead scientist approaches this, even as he, I believe, thinks of himself as being a very kind, aware individual and a very caring individual. It's very interesting dichotomy that Daniel Keyes writes into that role. So there's a female scientist who also is involved in the experiment, and she becomes much more emotionally and involved with Charlie, again through the arc of the story, and she begins, I think, to be troubled by this question of what are we doing to Charlie as a young man, as a human being, as opposed to someone who's volunteered to be the subject of this scientific experiment. Seems you have to have a little more cocktail, right? So another theme of the book is the nature of happiness. So I think even today, there's somehow a belief that the smarter we get, the happier we'll be. I don't think that's ever been true. I don't know that intellectual ability and emotions have any connection per se. And certainly that somebody is particularly intellectually developed says nothing about whether they're a happy person, a sad person, a kind person, a person somewhat devoid of human feeling. The two have no correlation, even though I think it's very popular in our society to consider that there are the smarter the person is, the more emotionally intelligent they are, the kinder they are because they understand how important kindness is. I have not observed that in life. I've never looked for a study on this, but I've never seen a study that shows a correlation, let alone a causation, between intellectual intelligence and emotional intelligence. So the Flowers for Algernon, it explores that question, and perhaps this is one of the reasons why I like the book so much. I think it shows that there is not a connection or a correlation between the two necessarily. These are two different aspects of human beings, and each needs to be cultivated in its own way, so that if it is good to be more intellectually developed, that's one thing. If it is good, and I believe it is, to be more emotionally developed, that also happens in its own way, and there isn't much of any sort of cross-pollination between those two. Now, by the way, you might have noticed that I asked the question, is intellectual growth a good thing? And I asked the same question about emotional growth, but I answered at that time, I think emotional growth is a good thing. I think we all should strive for emotional growth. I think intellectual growth may be a good thing. I think it depends, why are we pursuing it? How are we pursuing it? Some people, I think, pursue intellectual growth in order to lord it over other people. And on a certain level, I think that person might be better off being less intellectually developed. The last thing we need is more people doing this to us because they think they're smarter than we are. On the other hand, if we pursue intellectual growth in order to gain greater insight into such things as human history, in order to gain insight into how the world works, perhaps on a scientific level or on a spiritual level. So these are good things, because while they're not the same thing as emotional growth, I think they are working on a somewhat parallel track with our emotional growth, because there's meaning behind, there's an emotional meaning. When I say emotional, I mean, maybe I should say a humanistic meaning behind the striving for intellectual growth. Whereas inherent in striving for emotional growth is the humanist mandate of being able to better understand, better relate to, better help our fellow human beings, as well as all of God's creation. So nature of happiness, that's another theme in the book. Another one, I'm just gonna do two more, is the aspect of alienation and isolation that Charlie Gordon experiences. The more intellectually, the more he grows intellectually, it's almost as if it becomes harder for him to relate to other people. So his intelligence becomes a barrier to what it seems like he really wants, which is true friendships, the ability to really connect with other people. Those two are fighting each other. And part of that may be because Charlie's desire for intellectual growth isn't anything more than the desire for intellectual growth. There is no human sense behind it as to how is this going to serve me to make me a better human being. So interestingly, and that's where his lack of, or his emotional immaturity, I think, really is a it holds back the usefulness of his intellectual growth, because he doesn't understand that intellectual growth for its own sake oftentimes, if not always, does not get us where we really want to go. Quite to the contrary, in Charlie's case, it causes him to feel ever more isolated from other people, ever more alienated even from the people that he does know, from, for example, his former work colleagues, from the female scientist with whom he interacts. And so he as much as he feels he's gaining an aspect of himself through his intellectual growth, you can see that he's also feeling he's losing part of himself as his ability to connect with other people gets more tenuous and more tenuous and more tenuous, drives him farther and farther apart. And finally, as he sees what happens to Algernon as the result of taking the drug, how it's essentially destroying Algernon, Charlie comes to the realization that, even though he was told the change would not be permanent, really what that means. So as he starts to hit the nadir of his intellectual level and it starts to decline, he retains enough of it to realize he's losing something, and he feels the loss, and yet because he's powerless, I should say, powerless to stop it and to stop him becoming essential, or to stop what's happening to him in the same way that that happened to Algernon. There's a desperation is probably too strong a word, but there's true tragedy there. We're so used to saying, oh, this happened, it's such a tragedy. Tragedy is deeper than something bad or something sorrowful. tragedy is almost the understanding of a bad thing happening as it's happening, and the realization that loss is coming, the loss is building. There's a true pathos there. So if you've ever read the Greek tragedies, they of course capture that the essence of tragedy so well. So there is somewhat, now that I think about it and mention it, there is somewhat of that sense of sort of Greek tragedy in Flowers for Algernon as the story comes to a close. So I've mentioned several things that I really loved about the book. One of them, of course, is doing something that my daughter asked me to do. That she loves to read, I love to read, so it was kind of connecting on a shared passion. That was certainly one reason why I love the book. The second reason I love the book is I do like literature that has stood the test of time. So I love Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, Thomas Hardy, Dean Howell. So most of the literature I read, by the way, is from the 19th century. I don't read a whole lot of 20th century literature. Most of what I read from the 20th century, for those of you who saw my show on the Maltese Falcon, so mostly sort of detective and crime fiction from the 20th century, especially kind of the first half of the 20th century. So there is a quality to the writing that is different than contemporary fiction. So there were certain rules of writing. They weren't written down, but there was an idea that you were required to use complex language to convey ideas, and not to clobber your reader over the head with those ideas, but to bring the reader along and see if you could sort of sway the reader to your point of view. That is really a part of literature through certainly the early 20th century, and for many writers, even into the middle of the 20th century, that from the literature I've read of the second half of the 20th century it's not there as much. It's somewhat there, for example, in Kurt Vonnegut, for example, although his novels are much more hard hitting. In terms of a latter half of the 20th century, Kurt Vonnegut is probably the one I've read the most of, and his books are wonderful, but they don't have the same literary quality that 19th and early 20th century literature has. So that's another aspect of the book that I really enjoyed. And the third aspect that I really enjoyed is all of these themes. So they were interwoven, they were complex, and they were not resolved. So they gave me, as the reader, an opportunity to explore them and, to a large extent, come to my own conclusions about the various issues that I've mentioned: intellectual growth versus emotional growth, the treatment of the mentally disabled, the ethics of science, the nature of happiness, etc. The various themes that I've talked about during this show. It gave me the opportunity to explore them and draw my own conclusions without essentially putting on me the burden of what the author thought were the right conclusions. And I would argue, by the way, that that's the sign of a very confident writer, because he didn't need me to come to the same conclusions that he came to. And I think that shows a tremendous amount of maturity on the part of the writer, right? This is a discussion I had several times with my daughter, that as her father who loves her, I don't require her, I don't need her to agree with me really on much of anything in order for me to love her. What I require is, if I can use that word, is a relationship with her, and in order to have that be, build into an adult relationship, she needs the space to be able to figure out who she is, unburdened by expectations about that she may be drawing from me. And that, by the way, that's different than saying, I'm non-judgmental. That is not the case. So my daughter clearly knows what I think is right and wrong. What she also knows is that I'm open to a discussion that would potentially challenge my beliefs, and that I will engage in that discussion with her. And if she draws a different conclusion than I do, that doesn't mean that therefore, our relationship is over. Quite to the contrary, my hope is that we will have a lifelong conversation about these issues, and perhaps most especially about the issues with which we disagree, because we'll be informed by each other's disagreement and perhaps gain ever more clarity about our own perspective on these issues. And in the end, that's what I think. Let me get the light on there. That's what I think Flowers for Algernon gives us the opportunity to do. So by reading and rereading this book, we can have a lifelong, in essence, a conversation with Daniel Keyes, with Charlie Gordon, and the other characters about these various themes. And they will stand as a touchstone for us as we hopefully gain ever greater emotional growth that will serve us through our lives. So that's why I recommend Flowers for Algernon to you. I will put a link to it in the show notes, of course, and like all the links in my show notes, they are affiliate links. I think I get like 3 cents if you use the affiliate link to click through and buy the book. I don't put the links in there to get the 3 cents. I put them in there to allow you to get the book. But why not? As we say in Yiddish, "Nem de geld." I'll take the 3 cents. So I really do encourage you to read the book. And if you take me up on my recommendation, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in my social media, the social media for the show. All of those links will be in the show notes as well after it posts on YouTube. And tell me where you agree with my conclusions, where you disagree with my conclusions. Maybe we'll start what will become a lifelong dialogue that will help both of us grow intellectually, and in the end, that's a lot of what Jiggers' place is about. You may say, well, wait, I thought it was about cocktails. Well, I think that a cocktail helps us relax, and it opens us up to maybe some emotional growth that we might not have been open to previously, and that's really what part of what life is about, to develop ourselves as individuals, so that we can interact with our fellow human beings in a more enriching way. So I can't take a final sip of my drink. Well, maybe I can. There you go, just a little bit. Final sip of the cocktail. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. And this is my last show for this week. So I'll wish you a wonderful evening and a wonderful wind up to the week. And just a couple of reminders. Next week on Monday at 10 a.m. is my show, Trust and Estates Weekly. And I'm going to be talking about the power relationships between the different parties involved in the administration of an estate. This is a topic that I've become much more aware of in my practice. And so I hope you'll join me for that if you're involved in trusts, probates, estates. I would particularly love to hear your thoughts about what I say. On Tuesday at 10 a.m. is my show, Business Lessons from the Military. Let's see if I can remember what the show is going to be about. Oh, yes. So it's going to be about how Pershing's approach to battle changed from when he was involved in the border skirmishes against Pancho Villa versus how he conducted the American Expeditionary Force during World War I. And there are lessons for us to learn from that. And then on Wednesday at 10 a.m. is my show, People Making Money. And I'm going to be talking about another wonderful book. It's called The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. And one of the things we can do to most help ourselves in life is to develop routines that are just embedded in how we do things that support us toward gaining success. So I think I titled the show Routines for Success or something like that. So that'll be on Wednesday, People Making Money. Again, all the times, 10 a.m. Pacific time. So once again, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, this evening. Wishing you all the best going forward, and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you really are my belle. Courage at all times, my friend.